Right, hello everybody. That's working, isn't it? Yeah. Welcome to this session on challenges and opportunities in constructing national scale scenarios for the SSPs, RCPs and other scenario framings. My name is Mark Rounsell. I'm from the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology in Germany and the University of Edinburgh in the UK. And I'm co-organising this session with Paula Harrison, who's in the front row here, and Rob Dunford, who's not in the front row here, who are both from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And we're ably assisted by Simona, our wonderful assistant, who will be taking notes and moderating any online questions. So that's how we're going to organise ourselves in this session. This session is a little bit different as well in terms of the format, because we actually have three speakers who are sat in the front here. I'm going to introduce them to you in a moment. So we're trying to keep the talks to a minimum, but we're going to go for quality rather than quantity. And the intention is that at the end of the day, because everyone will be really fresh and bright-eyed and bushy-tailed at 5:30, or sometime after that, we're going to have more of a moderated discussion. We're going to have the speakers here as a panel, and we want you to engage in the conversation around the topic of this session. And that topic, as I said, is all around the sort of emerging number of studies that are exploring how one can interpret or extend or downscale or do lots of different things with global framings of scenario development, such as the SSPs and RCPs, how one can take that framing and apply them to the national scale level. So that's what we want to explore. We want to look at the construction of both qualitative and quantitative scenarios in these different scenario framings in different national contexts. And we've got three individual studies, one for the UK, one from Finland, and a study in Africa, to explore these types of issues across those different socioeconomic contexts. We want to look at how these studies have focused on interpreting the different drivers of socioeconomic change, how they've used quantitative modelling in some cases to look at projecting future socioeconomic change indicators. And in many cases, we also want to look at the use of participatory approaches, the engagement with stakeholders in order to frame the sort of national contexts within these broader, often global scale scenario framings. So that's what we're trying to do here. And we've got two high-level framing questions that we want to have a discussion around. The first one is how can the regional applicability of SSP-RCP type scenarios be improved? What can we do better with these types of national scale studies? And clearly these studies are really important because they are resonating with national scale policymakers, so they often have a very direct policy impact. So that's the first thing. And the second question we want to frame this session around is, should we be aiming for consistency across these different studies in terms of methods, or should we be exploring diversity, or maybe some mix of the two, in how we look at methods for downscaling or extending these scenarios? And what is their compatibility and comparability across different scales and across different studies? Are there more generic lessons that we can learn from that? So as I said, we've got three presentations from the three people here. We'll look forward to those talks in a moment. And we will finish with a panel discussion. Just to start your engagement, those two high-level questions I mentioned is going to frame the discussion we're going to have. And we want you to fully engage, and that includes you, wherever you are, in Zoom room, people who are online. There's probably hundreds of people online listening to this at the moment, aren't there? So we want you to engage as well. So the way you can do that, so please take your time. I know it's a bit tricky with the internet access at the moment, but if you go to the session 8, we are session 8, the session 8 area of the Connect online app system for this meeting, you will find, I forget what it's called, but you will find a document under the subheading called Documents, which actually has these framing questions in there. So whether you're online or whether you're in the room, feel free to start posting your responses to some of these questions or just raising questions yourselves or issues in this online document. And Simona and myself will try and check on what's going on, what comes out through that process of the online documentation, and we'll try and raise some of those issues when we have a discussion later on. But it also means you can have a look at what the questions are as well. So in case you can't remember what I've just said, they are written down in black and white, and you can have a look at that. And we have a few other questions as well we'd like to explore with you around, what are the notable advances for national scale scenario development? What are other features of these scenarios which have either hindered progress or maybe helped progress in doing national scale applications? And what are the key modifications or improvements that we could think about going forward into the future that would enable us to better improve the types of applications that we're interested in? Okay, so that's broadly where we're going with that session. I hope that's okay. If anyone's got any questions or unsure, then please, now is an opportunity to ask those. If not, this is going to be a really exciting session, okay? Right, so I need to convince you of that. We got some great speakers. I know it's the end of the day, but you will love it. This is probably going to be the highlight of your 3 days in this conference, is right here this evening, and you will be telling your children that you were there in however many years' time. So to start us rolling with lots of excitement and dynamism, I'd like to introduce you to Paula, who's going to talk about the UK SSPs. Over to you, Paula. Oh, we need to flip that up.
Go. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, my name's Paula Harrison. I'm from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. I'm going to be talking to you about a participatory process that we developed to create national scale scenarios of the SSPs for the UK. And I'm going to take you through the series of products that we created, which were both qualitative and quantitative. And of course, this presentation is on behalf of many people, including Mark, who will be happy to take all of your questions about the talk afterwards, after his wonderful, exciting introduction. So, okay, so just to start by setting a bit of background and context about actually why did we need to develop UK versions of the shared socioeconomic pathways. And again, this was mainly because we already had climate projections for the UK that were based on the RCPs, and we'd had these for some time. These were known as the UK Climate Projections 2018, but we'd had no regionally enriched versions of the global SSPs that academics or policy people could use alongside of these RCP-based climate projections. So this was recognised as a gap, because we didn't have the full common scenario framework that would facilitate sort of the UK research on climate risks and resilience in a framework that was consistent with the global context and with the IPCC process, and would also allow sort of the UK research to be able to be embedded and evolve alongside research elsewhere in the world and allow that important cross-scale analysis. It was also very important as well because we have a cycle of climate change risk assessments that happen every 5 years, and these are a part of the UK Climate Change Acts. And again, there was a lack of socioeconomic scenarios going into that climate change risk assessment, and hence it was seen as a gap that needed to be filled. So what did we do? We did 3 types of extensions to the SSPs. These were firstly spatial extensions, so we took the global and European versions of the SSPs and we used them to contextualise regional scenario development in the UK, but also for the 4 nations in the UK, so that's England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. We also did temporal extensions, and that meant that we just provided additional detail on how those scenarios evolved over time from the present right up to 2100. So that was what kind of events were going to happen throughout that time period and how did they build upon each other in a timeline. And then we did a sectoral extensions as well. And here again, we tried to get a balance because the idea was to create a set of national scenarios that would be applicable to the wider UK community. So we included a very wide range of sectors from agriculture, forestry, biodiversity, water, housing, infrastructure, energy, health. So of course we couldn't include those at lots and lots of detail, but we tried to ensure that there were little bits of information on all of those sectors, and we tried to ensure that we included people from those sectors in the participatory development, so that again, if people were working in those sectors and needed more information, they then had a basis on which they could do further extensions. So we did this participatory approach, and the idea was that we were going to engage with national level stakeholders to bring in then their knowledge on local drivers, and then to combine that with higher level information from both the global and the European SSPs. And we did this through 2 projects. And the first project was called the UK Scape Project. That allowed us to have a physical workshop with stakeholders where we were able to talk about the important drivers for the UK, to develop events and create a set of narratives and some tables of trends. We also followed that up by 2 questionnaires, one with the workshop participants and then one with the wider community. We then had an additional project, which was part of the UK Climate Resilience Programme, and this allowed us to do another stakeholder workshop. This one was done online because the pandemic had started. That allowed us to be more inclusive, to bring in more stakeholders into the process, to build on the narratives further, to create and further extend the tables of trends, and also to add some new products, to look at the interrelationships within the narratives, to create systems diagrams. We were also able to conduct sets of semi-instructed interviews as well, and they were particularly focused on further elaborating country-specific detail within those narratives. And here, by country-specific, I mean England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, not the UK. And then we did, again, a final questionnaire that went out to all of those who were involved in the process, again, to do a final cross-check that they could see their work within those final narratives and the other scenario products. So again, just to briefly take you through some aspects of that process, in both of our stakeholder workshops, the physical and the online, we started with just asking the participants to suggest those drivers that are particularly important, but also uncertain for determining societal development in the UK over this century. So in the physical workshop, we did that with lots of post-its stuck on the wall that participants all clustered together into similar driver categories. When we did it online, we were able to use some of the technology that through Mentimeter as well, where we started to ask participants to suggest drivers, and then other participants suggested similar drivers through Mentimeter that automatically created word clouds live during the different online sessions. And what we did in the second workshop is we deliberately held back the work in the first workshop where the participants identified their driver clusters, and we only revealed those to the second workshop after they'd gone through the process themselves, because then we were able to go through a consensus process of having a look how close the two aspects of driver identification were, and to be able to merge the two sets together. And that came up with the 14 driver categories that are shown in the table in the green box, and they range from things like the policy and governance, international relations, to economic development, social structure, and then to certain important sectors such as energy, food, and health, and transport. What we then did with stakeholders, we went through a process of them trying to look at the different polarities for each of those driver categories and how they mapped onto the European and the global SSPs, so that stakeholders could understand how the 5 SSPs differentiated from each other for the UK situation. And once we'd done that exercise, stakeholders then went out and started to brainstorm information to create the narratives. So what we did here in the first physical workshop, stakeholders went out into individual SSP groups, and with lots and lots of post-its and through a facilitated process, they brainstormed events for different sectors over time, positioning them on a timeline through lots of different prompts. And from that, they were able to identify and elaborate broad lines of development for the different range of sectors. That led to our first draft narratives, which we checked via the questionnaire, and that became the first set of narratives coming out from that first project. Because we then had this opportunity of a second project, what we then did when we went out to do the narrative development is we started with the existing set of narratives in a Google Doc that we shared with participants in our SSP groups. And again, through a facilitated process, we had certain questions that queried those narratives that were already existing to see if the new set of stakeholders thought they were consistent with the drivers that they had just brainstormed, where they thought they needed elaboration, and where they needed further cross-checking. And again, that allowed us to much further elaborate those narratives. We then had sets of semi-structured interviews, which was another elaboration process, and then there was the final questionnaire before we got to the final set of narratives. This is what they look like. They're about 5 to 6 pages in length per SSP. Each has an abstract, and then it has sections that describe how events evolve over time in 3 time periods, from present to 2040, from 2040 to 2070, from 2070 to 2100. And then we have a set of paragraphs which describe certain specifics that happen in the 4 nations of the UK. So we have separate aspects for England, for Wales, for Scotland, and then for Northern Ireland. So what we did then as part of the process in the online workshop is in between the 2 sessions on the narratives, we had a session on asking the stakeholders to think about the interrelationships between those different key driver clusters. And we did this in terms of creating live with them systems diagrams. And again, this is just a system diagram that visualizes the narrative. It isn't an operational model. So we started literally with just a blank PowerPoint or another piece of software we used called VUE, V-U-E. And we had the 14 driver category as nodes, and that's how we started. And then through a facilitated process, working with the stakeholders, they told us what interrelationships they thought existed within the narratives, and we live drew those different relationships with the justification and description of those interrelationships as we went through the process. And again, at the end of that process, we then went back into our session on the narratives so that any new information that they had learned through that process on driver interrelations could be then embedded back into the narrative, or any inconsistencies that had come up from the previous narrative could be corrected when they went back into the next session. One thing we also did, which is, if you can see, again, these slides will be on the at the Connect, IIASA Connect thing, but in the top right-hand corner up there, there is a link to videos we created. So we animated these system diagrams so that they appear over time in terms of how the interrelationships within each SSP develop. So please feel free to go and have a look at those, and they've got exciting voiceovers from the project team for each of the SSPs. Another product we created was these tables of semi-quantitative trends, and this was here to try and take that complexity of these narratives that were 5 to 6 pages long and to try and simplify them into sets of trends that could be used by modelling teams. or in other studies where they needed to actually see how different indicators change over time. And again, here, this is in trends are just in terms of relative directions and magnitudes of changes over time. But we did this for a very wide range of socioeconomic variables. So we did it for 50 variables in total. And we used 3 different methods here. So we took population and GDP directly from the global SSP database, which is hosted by IIASA. And the stakeholders are very keen for us to do that because they wanted to maintain that consistency with the global SSPs. 16 of the variables we elicited the trends with stakeholders, 8 in one workshop, 8 in the second workshop, and the rest were done by the project team through an expert interpretation of the narratives. And the graph in this slide just is an illustration of the process that we used in the online workshop. The dark lines are the individual lines that were plotted by stakeholders. So we asked stakeholders to independently plot their lines, put a rationale and a confidence score for their line, and then we created an online software platform where they could automatically upload their graphs. They would be compiled on top of the other participants in their SSP, so we could see how much their lines diverged. And you can see with this example, they diverged a lot. But then that was followed up by a consensus discussion with a facilitator where everyone in the group talked through the rationale behind their trends, and they agreed on the red line, which was the consensus trend. So this is the range of 50 variables we covered. And again, I'm not going to go into that in great amount of details. Again, it's just a whole range of variables going from things to do with demography, things to go with urbanization, education and health, things to do with technological development, energy, the environment, the economy, things to do with consumption, and then things to do with trade and policies and institutions. So we tried to cover a wide range of variables that we thought the community would need. And we did go through some consultation with a user panel to try and help us understand what were those types of variables. This is an example of what the final tables of trends look like. So for each of those 50 variables, we present them on a 7-point scale. We do that in terms of symbols, so which is the pluses, the minuses, and the zeros, and also then in terms of graphs. There's a definition for each of those variables and a justification or an explanation of the trend under each of the graphs. And again, we present them side by side, so you can start to compare and contrast the different SSPs next to each other. So the final product I want to talk about is the quantification of the variables. And again, here we did some spatially explicit quantification for just a smaller number of variables, but there was 25 in total. The methods we used varied, and the spatial resolutions we created them at also varied, and that was very much due to basically what models or methods we had available to us, but also what historic data was available at what spatial resolutions. So this table here just summarizes the types of methods we use. So they went from, on one side, literally just very simple disaggregation from the IIASA SSP database, to using a couple of integrated assessment models or a couple of land system models, to using some kind of a stakeholder and expert-driven fuzzy sets method where we took the narratives and the tables of trends and went through a process of what would that look like if they were in terms of actual units, and we looked at indicators of regional divergence and convergence that were consistent with the narratives. And I'm just going to show 2 very quick examples because I don't have time to do any more. This is one for one of the healthcare indicators that we did through the expert assessment of the narratives. The indicator is the availability of GPs per 100,000 capita. And again, the graph at the bottom is a bit of an indication of how we came up with different trends per SSPs. There are actual numbers, units on that graph, although I know you won't be able to see it so small. But we gave the experts also the range of the range in this indicator for the UK, for Europe, and for the rest of the world, as well as historic trends to help guide the graphs. Then we used information from the narratives on whether the regional patterns were likely to converge or diverge, so we could actually use another function on top to create the final spatial patterns. And again, they were then given in as maps and as a database in decadal time slices. And then the final one I just want to quickly bring up which is slightly different, and this really came strongly from the user community in that they really wanted us to do land use projections as well as the other indicators that we did. And this was a little bit different because it's the only indicator that is not climate independent. So here we had to couple SSPs and RCPs, and I'm only showing a few of them here. And we created an agent-based model here called CraftyGP to be able to simulate the narratives for Great Britain. And literally just quickly contrast the trends here for SSP1, which is combined with RCP 2.6. And again, here we see pretty much a large-scale movement to much more sustainable, productive landscapes. This includes having native tree species in the forest system. We see an expansion of conservation areas. And this is really driven by a decreasing in demand in food and a very much increasing demand from the population for sustainable products and for also environmental benefits. If you contrast that with SSP5 up here, if you look in red to start with, you see a massive expansion of urban areas, which is a function of a very large population growth, but also very poor planning policy, which leads to very sprawled urban spread. And we see a very large intensification of the land use system. So you can see the colouring is much darker in this particular one in terms of both productive arable systems and pastoral systems. Pastoral systems maintained much more in SSP5 because there is a maintained demand for meat in this scenario compared to some of the others. And then I will just conclude because I'm getting the eye. So basically, we created a set of different qualitative and quantitative products. These are summarized here in terms of the narratives, which were these the booklet at the top, which is these 5 to 6 page descriptions. We've got the systems diagrams, which is a visualization of the narrative or an animation of the narrative. And then we've got these tables of trends of these 50 variables, so you can start to see how the patterns of certain indicators change in relation to each other. Then we've got these sets of quantitative projections, which were available both in terms of maps, but also a database with a user manual. And we also created a regridding tool so that the users could move between the different spatial projections that we had to use for different indicators. And then finally, we created an interface to help the user community access all those different products through a common interface, which was based on the system diagram. And I will leave it at that and just sort of say thank you again to the large team that was involved in this and our funders. The 2 links at the bottom, particularly this top one here, will take you to all of those products. The bottom link will take you to some information on some other work that we're doing with consistent pollution scenarios to go in the scenario framework and some work on applying them to biodiversity. So thank you.
Thank you. Very fascinating. A link on the last page said socioeconomic scenarios for climate research and policy. Can you reflect a little bit on how they were taken up in research for quantitative modeling or so, and in policy, and anything that you would possibly do a little bit differently if you were to do it again?
Okay, very interesting question. I suspect if you come back and ask me that in 5 years, I might be able to give you a better answer, because literally we only finished them last year. So we're at the minute of trying to ensure the community is aware of them. And we know now that they're being taken up. And we've met people at the meeting who have just come up to us and said, I'm using your UK SSPs, which is brilliant. But we haven't really been able to yet collect that knowledge. I literally got an email from the Met Office, whose the funding came through for the second part of this work, basically saying that they've just been asked if they can link it to another big database as well to make it more available. So I think we're gradually at that stage where hopefully we'll see more and more uptake. We did have people involved from policy, and we made sure we had all of the devolved administrations. So we had Welsh Government, Scottish Government, etc., as well as UK Government involved in it. So the awareness is there in policy that these exist. To be honest, the policy is quite, at the minute, got a lot to do in terms of lots of new co-design of, or design of new policies following Brexit, but this is still quite high on the agenda, and it certainly was the people from BASE, our business, enterprise and industrial strategy, which is in charge of sort of the climate mitigation side. They were really, really keen that we remain consistent with the global SSPs, and it was them who were constantly saying that even when the narratives were slightly diverging from the SSP global database of population and GDP, that we should stick with them and even live with slightly with the divergence to the narrative. So there is awareness there. How much more it'll get taken up, hopefully we'll find out in the next couple of years.
Hi, thanks for an interesting talk. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how you introduced the SSPs. Was it a play? Was there like a professional communicator who came in to describe it? And in particular, what I'm curious about is some of the kind of fractionated scenarios. Was that interpreted as fractionated within the UK, or UK as opposed to the rest of the world being fractionated?
Yeah, so that's great. So yes, so again, it was done slightly different, I guess, in the physical to online. But it kind of followed a similar format in that we deliberately didn't introduce the SSPs at the beginning of the workshop. So we let them brainstorm about drivers in the UK context first, without them knowing anything about the SSPs. And then we went through we had a one person in the team who was SSP1, one who was SSP2, and then we kind of went round them and they went through, these are the key aspects of this of this scenario, these are the main drivers of what's happening in globally and in Europe. And they got introduced to that after they'd talked through their own drivers for the UK. And then after that, we in the physical workshop, we allowed the stakeholders to choose the SSPs they wanted to mainly focus on in terms of elaborating the narrative. In the online workshop, we realized that was going to be too difficult. So we put stakeholders into groups to ensure that we had the diversity of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, represented them, as well as sectors and lots of other complicated things. But we did have a pause where if anyone's not happy in their group, they could shift and we could try and do some things. In terms of fragmentation, that was really interesting. So SSP3, if I'd have had a bit more time, I would have spent more time on the land use projections, because there you can see the national boundaries for SSP3, because the UK breaks apart in SSP3. So the fragmentation does happen internally as well as with the rest of the world. And it starts by Scotland going independent and then the other countries following through. And then eventually actually governance almost collapses completely within the UK, and it almost goes through almost back to clans and things like that right at the very end. So it's quite extreme, but this is what the stakeholders were thinking by the time you got to 2100. It's a long way away.
You'll be pleased to hear that in that process I was Mr. SSP5.
Yeah.
I think maybe time for one more, and then we'll save the questions for later in the discussion. Okay? There's some other hands up around here. Tim, you seem really keen. Answer the question. Go on then.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Very nice presentation. And I actually have three sort of small questions. So the first one is about the 14 drivers and whether you incorporated those in your first stakeholder discussions and how you did that. Secondly, it was a minor one, but what happened to Northern Ireland with the crafty one? Was this a crafty ploy to get rid of them or something? And thirdly, again, on the fragmentation issue, we've had some issues about this term regional rivalry and how you interpret regional rivalry for working at national or subnational scale. So what are the regions that are encountering that rivalry? And so we've interpreted it one way, you clearly another way, and I'm just wondering, this is a more general question.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to have to try and remember what your first point was, which was maybe 14 drivers, that was it, okay. So the first workshop, they didn't know anything. Well, both workshops at the beginning didn't know anything about the driver category. So obviously the first workshop, that no categories existed, they came up with their own set of categories. The second workshop, we obviously knew it, but we hid them. So they came up with their own categories, and then we revealed them at the end of that session and asked them to merge. And we've just writing a paper that's under review at the minute that is comparing the first set of UK SSPs with version 2 of UK SSPs and what changed and why in terms of where they wanted more elaboration, where they thought things were too specific, and there's lots of interesting changes that happened. Nothing really substantial and major, but lots of little tweaks that happened that came up. So I'll point you to that paper when it comes out. And the Crafty was just a data issue, I'm afraid, for Northern Ireland. And regional rivalry, well, that's very similar to the answer. Where we basically took it at the nation level, and that very much came also from stakeholders. And I don't know whether that was because we had quite a lot of the devolved administrations there, so they obviously just went to, that means Scotland will break away, then all the other nations will follow. But then they didn't stop there. They thought it would collapse even further. So.
Great. Thank you very much, Paula. Thank you. I told you it was going to be exciting. Right, we're only 20 minutes in and we've had complete societal breakdown already. Marvellous. That's what we want to hear. Anyway, there's even more to come. So I'm going to introduce you to Anna Lipsanen, I believe that's not too badly pronounced, who's going to tell us now, we're going to move to Finland.
Yeah.
My name is Anna Lipsanen, and I come from the Finnish Environment Institute Climate Change Program. And today I will be telling you, not visible yet, now maybe? Yes, excellent. On behalf of my colleagues here, I will be telling you about our ongoing research on climate scenarios, and particularly focusing on the socio-economic development aspect in the health and social welfare sector in Finland. And here you can see the content of my talk today. So first I will be introducing you to and giving you a background for creating these SSPs for the health and social welfare sector. Then I will give you a detailed overview of our method for co-developing these sectoral SSP narratives, followed by key results from the narratives, and finalizing with next steps and concluding remarks. And, well, most of you are hopefully quite familiar with SSPs at this point, at least, but let's still give a very brief recap on SSPs. So they are 5 alternative global characterizations of plausible societal futures. And they have both quantitative and qualitative components, and the qualitative narrative aspect in particular is what I will be focusing on in this talk today. Now, the SSP extensions then can give a detailed regional and/or sectoral view of future developments, and can, for instance, facilitate national or sectoral climate change research. However, there are some methodological challenges related to this, for instance, how to interpret these global narratives at regional level, and also how to co-produce the SSP narratives efficiently with stakeholders. And these methodological challenges is also what we were trying to address in our study. So why are we focusing on the health and social welfare sector then? Well, we do know that there are health impacts of climate change, such as those related to extreme heat and changing winter conditions, especially in the north. But however, there are still uncertainties on human health under a changing climate, and that it's understudied. This health and social welfare sector in Finland has seen to be behind in climate policy development in Finland. And this working in this sector, this gives us a good opportunity to also to engage with the stakeholders. Now, keeping this in mind, we have selected in the Academy of Finland funded Plumes project 2 sectors to scrutinize: agriculture and food, and health and social welfare. And the health and social welfare is the sector I'll be focusing on today, just to be clear. And we had an objective to co-create broad national SSP narratives for the health sector in Finland as extensions of these global SSP narratives. Now then let's move on to the methodological challenges and how we aim to solve them. So a key part of our research was a workshop that we organized in Helsinki in May 2019. We had an interdisciplinary research team that organized this event, and approximately 40 stakeholders from different organizations and institutions, ministries, municipalities, research and care organizations as well, for instance. And here you can see the 5 SSPs, and that we actually omitted SSP2 from our study for it being judged to offer less insightful trends for us to use in this study. Then, in order to have as broad of a spectrum of sectoral developments as possible, we decided to look at this narrative development from the perspective of from three perspectives. They were those of citizens, service providers, and decision makers, as well as through 5 themes: society and lifestyle, healthcare system, research and technology, education and information, and the environment. And this gave us a matrix that we were using at the workshop to develop these narratives with the stakeholders. Now, when the framework was decided, we went on to execute the actual workshop. So in the workshop, we had 4 facilitators, each allocated one of the 4 SSPs that we dealt with. We had 2 group discussions, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, followed by a final plenary. The representatives in each of these groups were predetermined, and we had the language in. We had the workshop in Finnish, except for the introductory presentations and the SSP posters that we gave at the workshop to the stakeholders to get familiarized with SSPs. And here you can see an example of such a poster. And we instructed them to think of the development of these SSPs through this frame that we provided for each of the 4 SSPs. Then, even though this workshop I just described has been a crucial part of our study, I would also like to give you a more detailed overview of the entire method we have used, or as we would like to call them, the 7 steps to heaven that we are aiming to use to construct these full narrative extensions. So in the first step, we selected the SSPs and set the context for this sector based on literature review, as well as some expert discussions around the topic. We then went on to specify the themes and perspectives, which I described to you, and also at this point we identified the key workshop participants that we wanted to attend the workshop. At step 3, we had the facilitated stakeholder workshop, and we also had already besides the group and plenary sessions I described, we also iterated the initial result of the outcomes already at the workshop with the stakeholders. Then after the workshop, the stakeholders were asked to give feedback through a web proposal survey. And then after these steps, we finally went to code and analyze the material of the workshop outputs, and where we aim to draft full narratives for each of the 4 SSPs. And when the narratives were finalized, we did some consistency checks with the research team that was involved in this process. In step 6, we iterated these draft narratives with the stakeholders so that they could provide comments and some insightful suggestions for the narratives. And finally, we made it to heaven after the 6 steps with finalized SSP narratives for the sector with detailed results involved. Now, as you can see, many of these steps have required input from researchers, but where research input was not used, we have filled the gap with input from stakeholders. And as you can see, both of these perspectives met at step 3 in the workshop. So the narratives are finalized, and they are about 1.5 pages each, so I won't read them out to you now here, but I would just give you just brief teasers of what each of these narratives actually hold. In SSP1, people are living in an equal society driven by knowledge and active participation. Soft values and an ecological, less consumer-oriented lifestyle are emphasized. In general, people are eating a healthy plant-based diet and have good access to health services. Technology and research are emphasized, and nature is considered at all levels of society, and its value in well-being is recognized. In SSP 3, society is unequal and polarized, stemming from strong nationalism. Self-interest, lobbying, and nepotism prevail, but communality is experienced in smaller units and in core groups that are cared for. There are large inequalities across the population regarding access to health services. And for instance, public health services cannot be provided for everyone, and there is emphasis on treating acute health issues. There are limited resources allocated to research and technological development, and the environment is not valued high in people's activities. More, it's seen merely as a resource. In the unequal world for in SSP4, the better off have the opportunity to choose their lifestyle and consumption habits, but a large proportion of citizens have no choice. Health inequalities are widening as the healthcare and service system is commercialized and targeted at different groups in contrasting ways. There is strong private sector in healthcare with comprehensive insurances for the elite, but majority have access to poorly resourced public sector. Research and technological development interests stem from the possibilities of commercialization. The environment is a valuable resource for the elite, but people less fortunate don't have access to the same environmental services as the elite. And finally, in SSP5, the individualism and consuming are valued high. Technology in particular has a cross-cutting dominant role in all walks of life, including in decision-making. Self-care applications dealing with personal health information are evolving, and there is demand for custom-made health studies. Markets determine what kind of health information and education is available. The environment has become a commercial community and a service that must be paid for, and for instance, visits to nature reserves and forest trips are increasingly paid for, and also every man's rights have been reduced in this world. So what is the next in our study? Excellent, good, thanks. We are finalizing our narrative analysis now that the narratives itself are done, and how these national narratives actually compare with the global and sectoral exercises done previously in this sector, and also at a global scale. We are also aiming to develop a basis for at least semi-quantitative indicators to help to summarize relative projections of sectoral trends in SSPs. They probably won't be as sophisticated as Paula has just presented us, but at least we will try to make a semi-quantitative effort here. And finally, alongside reporting these narratives in scientific journals, we are aiming to, or we will report these narratives on the National Climate Change Portal as well, climateguide.fi in Finnish, as they have been translated already from English to Finnish. I would also like to state that we are hoping that our study here can offer future context for climate change adaptation and mitigation decisions, and also that since we have heavily involved stakeholders in this process, we are hoping that we can increase legitimacy, credibility, and relevance of our study and of the narratives as well, and so that they actually can be useful to the stakeholders involved and for the sector itself. And then on a final note, I would like to say that the method used here to co-develop these SSP narrative extensions is potentially applicable for constructing similar extensions for other sectors on a national or regional scale as well. That's it, I guess. Well on time, hopefully, good. And then before I finish, I would also like to state that this research would not have been possible without the funding from the Academy of Finland. And I would also like to thank my esteemed colleagues from several institutions, you can see here listed, with whom I've been privileged to work with in this study. Thank you.
you. I have a question about the quantification you're planning. Are you planning this doing another stakeholder process, or because if I understood it right, you didn't ask any quantified estimates during the first workshop, right? And my second question would be, it's more if I understood it right, the 3 perspectives you've given in your framework, where are they at the end, or what happened with that?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks so much for the question. Excellent question about the quantification. So, short answer, no, we didn't ask any variables to be identified in the workshop. Hence the semi-quantitative effort of projecting some trends or even arrows that we've seen in some of these presentations at the conference, so that we can somehow not develop a baseline, but maybe provide a few variables relevant for this sector, so that we can show how these variables change within these SSPs in the sector. But no, it won't involve the stakeholders anymore. Yeah, and your second question was about the perspectives. Yeah, so the actual narratives are categorized more or less through the themes that I explained, and the perspective have been merged into these themes, so that all of these perspectives are dealt with in the finalized narratives. Good, thanks.
Thank you very much, Simona Wagner University. It was a very interesting presentation, and I see development, many similarities with UK SSPs and other European SSPs. If you want to indeed take it further to, for example, the transport sector, the energy sector, and try to capture the systemic view that was also presented by Tim, what would be your suggestion for a next extension? Would you start from those themes, or would you start from the finalized health SSPs that you developed? What would be some few tips?
Few tips. Thanks for the question. I'm not quite sure if I can give any good tips, but we have been we are in the first steps, as Tim presented, to make a regional effort of this, and we have more or less adjusted this process that we sort of scale up from these themes or systems within, or themes within a system, so that we can sort of provide, again, the stakeholders some context that they can discuss in. But of course, they need to be sort of identified depending on the sector in question. So probably not any like one size fits all mechanism, but yeah.
You might go through a similar UK SSP process where you have to adjust and maybe adjust some parts of the narrative.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
So I think we've got time for one more question, Matthias. I know you have questions. I'll save for the discussion later, because we've got a chance to come back later with any other questions. So please.
Hi, I'm Veruska from the University of Zurich. There is a study on the SSP, downscale the SSP for Finland, and they quantify them for the health risk. I was wondering if you have looked at that and see from that study if there is some idea also how to quantify the things that you have shown here. It was for the health risk.
Right. I'm not quite sure if I understood what you were aiming at. So
no, I was just wondering if you have compared, because you say you were thinking about quantifying some quantification. So if you are thinking about how this could be done, maybe looking also at what has been done for Finland in that context,
like
of in 5 SSP for Finland.
Right, like how it would have been quantified.
How it's been quantified there, and how you could look into that direction.
I know that some of the members of the Finnish delegation is here, so they might know better. But if I've understood correctly, there is quite limited amount of these types of or SSPs. This was the first time that SSPs were dealt with in the health sector in Finland, and we had this qualitative approach with the narratives, and the quantification is a black box still, I guess. So more or less we can maybe not start from scratch, but see what kind of other studies there might be for the sector, but related to SSP quantification, I'm not quite sure if they're there. But maybe other Finns might know better, but according to my knowledge, that's the case. Good, thanks. Yeah.
Right, so societal breakdown, 7 steps to heaven. where are we going next? There's only one answer to that, and it's Andy Challoner from the University of Leeds, who, if you're not already there, I'm sure will be whipping you up into a frenzy of excitement in our last formal presentation before we go back into a discussion in a moment. So Andy, over to you.
Opportunity to speak, thanks to billions of people on here, the funders, GCRF, AFRICAT from the UK, and I'm going to speak about stakeholder-driven scenarios for national scale climate-smart nutrition security, focusing on 4 countries in Africa, but we're expanding to other countries in Africa as well, and perhaps, in theory at least, the approach could be applied elsewhere. So this is the AFRICAT project with the aim of building capacity for identifying and implementing evidence-based policy pathways. So it's about policy pathways for climate-smart agri-food systems, nutrition-sensitive climate-smart agri-food systems. So we wanted evidence-based policy pathways, and to do that we developed something called the Integrated Future Estimator for Emissions and Diets. You can see the name there. You'll be hearing more about it in a minute. And it's think of it as a kind of integrated assessment framework, in contrast to integrated assessment model, where you build everything into a model. It's a sort of quantitative, qualitative combined approach. So the rationale for this is to be open and inclusive, to combine models with wider expertise and data, you can think of it, if you like, as a way of putting the experts kind of as components in the model. I don't usually say that to them because they don't tend to like that kind of language, but that's kind of how I think about it as a modeler in a way. And it's useful for problems that can be partially modelled with results enabled by a broader expertise base, which is to say pretty much all the kind of problems we speak about here. And you know, I don't think there are anywhere where you don't need that broader approach in interpreting, I would argue. So it's a flexible approach. You use appropriate complexity. You might use a detailed crop model for some of the really key crops. You might not necessarily use a detailed crop model for all the crops because it's expensive to do, and maybe there are other things you could be doing with that time and money. So it enables that sort of thinking about what's the appropriate degree of complexity with which to simulate each and understand each component. So you can use meta-analysis instead of crop models, for example. And scope for early stakeholder engagement to orient the work. So a kind of parallel line of evidence to IAMs and many others. So one way of thinking about that is kind of breadth, depth, and quantitative, qualitative. And this is schematic really is more thought about more from the perspective of my sort of community or my starting point, which is crop climate modelling. I've since kind of broadened out into kind of scenarios and integrated assessment, if you like. But is this thinking about, well, how deep do we need to go for some of the machine learning and crop breeding work that I'm involved in? The answer is yes. You really have to go quite deep and talk to people, genetic, molecular biologists, etc. But certainly not for this kind of thing. You can remain quite broad. And then there's a question of, well, what mixture of quantitative and qualitative? So I put more things on this diagram. We don't necessarily need to understand all of them. The SIDS is the climate impacts drivers, incidentally, which was spoken about in the first day. The cascading risks I did a bit of work on for the UK on risks across sectors and borders, which is more at the qualitative end. And what I'm talking about now really is the integrated assessment framework approach, which is that mixture, as I say, of quantitative and qualitative. So this diagram shows the kind of broadly the overall approach, and what my approach incidentally to the talk is to make sure you understand the methods, or the kind of where I'm coming from, where we're coming from with the methods, and I'll talk about the results to the degree that there's time, because you can look up on the iFeed website, you can get access to all sorts of more information, or indeed speak to me, of course, for more information. So, the diagrams here, the bubble diagrams here, just show the sequence of steps. So first of all, we had a scenario workshop, much like the others that have been described, with far fewer post-its, mostly because it was during the pandemic, so it was online. These then developed a series of narratives where we ran a whole bunch of models and produced maps and numbers. But the kind of key part for us, or the key different thing that we were doing in this approach, were these integration workshops, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute. And then coming out of that, we had kind of calibrated text. Basically, we followed the kind of IPCC calibrated uncertainty language about agreement and robustness. And so we had a kind of system in place that took expert comments on the model results in, and produced a set of text that then we put essentially policy facing documents in our online results portal. And the stakeholder input was crucial throughout, and I'll be saying more about that, but both for the inputs to the modelling, but also to our pathways to policy, our connections to the people involved in policy. It was kind of both of those things, giving us the inputs, but also giving us the conduit to speak to people in policy. So this is an example. I didn't put the country. It's Zambia. I did put the country of our scenarios. They're not. These aren't. We didn't use the SSPs, although actually you can see it's not difficult to map on to the SSPs. Challenges to adaptation, challenges to mitigation. Already? Oh my word! 5 minutes. Yeah. No. Okay. So these are the 4 scenarios that came out of Zambia, contrasting high and low climate risk with high and low market connectivity. This is a whole bunch of inputs that we had from the stakeholders that you probably can't read, but are about is maize going to expand, or is there going to be greater diversity, a movement away from maize and towards a diversity of crops? Is there going to be agricultural expansion in general in your country? And the approach was to say, what's bounding here? Is what's the kind of largest number you can imagine for this? What's the smallest number you can imagine? And then we modelled each side of it. So we made sure we were going to capture kind of reality by doing that. So not much time to talk about the components, but just to say a little bit about the trade nutrition trade-off, because here we ran, well, it wasn't even probably technically a model. We used the FAO food balance sheets together with some trade data and trade analysis from Chatham House, so that we could look at the way in which domestic production and trade interact to result in or not result in nutrition security. So these were the people in Chatham and in Aberdeen who are kind of components of our modelling system, even though I didn't necessarily use those words with them. This is a slide about the fact that we use the IPCC type method, so we can say high confidence, high agreement. We talk about robustness, so we use that same approach pretty much. We look across the literature and we look across the ensemble of runs that we've done, and that tells us about those 2 components, so we have a clear confidence statement at the end of it. And I will skip over that. This is the website to note down or go to if you're interested in more, not just the data, etc., but actually there are videos from people who took part. There's more information on the methods. Pretty soon we decided to write a methods paper about our approach, which is good, because then kind of partly on the back of that we're doing more work of this sort in Africa, so we'll be posting that soon on the website. And this is a bit of a summary of the whole process, from the kind of millions of model simulations across 4 different scenarios, and it's literally millions, through to these 1,000 plus implication statements, which are these IPCC type first order statements that come out of that modelling. Then we take a kind of, well, first of all, we had the calibrated statements, which were these kind of IPCC type statements, and then the implication statements were developed with a broader audience, people of experts, pests and diseases, livelihoods, all the things we decided actually are not a good idea, or we wouldn't have time to model. So that's where that kind of inclusivity comes in. Then we come up with the 4 country policy documents that are based off of the 16 underlying scenarios, and we put it all on the website. And we had some good opportunities for stakeholder engagement throughout. I mean, one learning lesson for us, for me at least, from the project, it wasn't the fact that we come up with this fantastic fantastic system for bringing in these experts and this system of workshops, etc., and the calibrated statements that meant that we had our conduit to policy. Actually, it was our partners, Van and the fact that they knew what was happening in each country when it was happening. And so they would say to us, do you want to talk to the South Africa Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Agriculture? There's a slot next week. Yes, we do. And we spoke to them, and it was kind of more on the basis of that. Other examples for the master plan and Malawi's Vision 2063. So it was those engagements, perhaps at the moment more than the policy documents, where we've had that clearer link through to policy, although of course those documents are kind of still there and still being drawn upon, so that will continue. This is an example of the results for Zambia. So here again are the four scenarios. So, and there are some counterintuitive ones. I won't talk through each of these components, but I'll just maybe go through the bullets. So productivity increases with high market connectivity, unsurprisingly, but it may come at the cost of sustainability in the sense of increased emissions. Adaptation and resilience to climate change improve with high market connectivity. Emissions rise with high market connectivity, although soil carbon increases help to balance. So you get a sense of what that level of balance is from the agricultural models. And then nutrition security improves only in the case of the high market connectivity and high climate change risk, which sounds counterintuitive, but the reason for that is we took in what the stakeholders told us about what would happen in different scenarios. And the answer was, when climate risk is higher, action on climate will be higher and adaptation will be successful. So actually this in this case resulted in a more positive outcome. They believed the politicians would respond positively to the challenge, which was good to see. Not much more to show actually, but this is just to show a little bit of kind of what's under the bonnet in terms of the nutrition security element, because this was one of the novel elements, I think, of what we did in going from the kind of agriculture, food, crop, climate area down to not just calorific security or even is there enough protein, but actually for each of these components to say what is happening in each of these micronutrients, how much at the national level of these micronutrients are available. So this contrasts, again, this counterintuitive result of 11 micronutrients improving and 2 getting worse under high climate risk and 2 almost the converse under the low climate change risk. But this ability to kind of get to that level of detail has been quite helpful for us in communicating results, because you really, when you start talking about nutrition security, I think it's something that really sort of impacts people a little bit more when you're discussing and presenting results. So last slide. Future research directions, the portal's there for people to dig into if they want to. The approach is there to build on, and we're going to be building on it in the 1CGIAR project called Climate, which has started this year, and we'll be looking at Zambia and Kenya. We'll also be looking at applying it in other areas of the globe, and in fact there's interest in Climate in applying it also in Senegal and Morocco and other countries with different suites of models potentially. Quite interested in the application to cascading risks, which I didn't say a lot about, but to me that's one of those areas where risks that cascade across sectors and indeed across borders are a really big challenge from a modelling perspective. You can't do it, and you need to bring in, it's one of those areas where you do need to bring in, again, model results perhaps to some extent, but certainly this sort of stakeholder element of having some calibrated way of talking about what the future scenarios are. So that's something I'd like to explore in the future. And in Kenya, we're going to be integrating the bottom-up sort of disruptive scenario approaches, so seeds of change, and cross-scale approaches. So the future of iFeed is going to be kind of, in a sense, have an even larger vision in that we want to be taking up what's happening on the ground, not just what our stakeholder expert group tells us is going to be happening, but actually what's occurring on the ground in different regions in this country, and how should that be represented in the scenarios that we look at. And I think that was indeed my last slide, just a reminder of the website. And sorry I couldn't give you a 12 steps to heaven. I couldn't give you societal breakdown, but I forgot to mention one of our 4 scenarios was the road to hell, so I'll end on that note.
Right, questions? Tim?
presentation, Andy. Thanks. Road to hell, I'm not sure I want to talk about that, but I was interested in your counterintuitive results for a kind of SSP5 looking type of scenario, combined with a high climate change or high climate risk. And I was wondering, what's the downside to this improvement in nutrition? Is it environmental degradation, soil degradation, and also how dependent would that be on the globalization, which I guess is probably assumed there, and the cross-border potential impacts of shocks elsewhere and stuff like that?
Yeah, cross-border, kind of, well, how shall I put it, out of scope, that could be a problem. Some of these more extreme events and cross-border implications. The trade and nutrition trade-off analysis, actually, most of our results were quite robust to that. So the different trade vignettes, as we call them, we didn't get much difference across those. There were some in some cases, but it was quite robust to that. So that was actually quite surprising. Environmental degradation, yeah, I mean, certainly soil health we looked at, and there was some cost in terms of that. And of course, emissions increase. Now, whether then there's a separate discussion, perhaps even we may be developing a separate paper on that question of, well, actually you may argue in Africa that emissions increase, and that's fair enough, right? So you quantify by how much emissions increase, and you say, well, this is the cost, and the benefit is this increased nutrition security. So, that may be acceptable, but yeah, it's definitely trade-offs. Yeah.
Okay, any more questions? I know, Simona, you had a question?
Yes, thank you. So Tim asked the first one, so it's only one. It's a methodological question. So you showed the stakeholder input throughout 4 steps, right, in the methodology. So the first one is narrative and then integrated assessment modeling. Just had a quick question on how did you connect the stakeholder input directly to the integrated assessment modeling? If you have any tips, I think many people here are interested. Exactly.
We literally just asked them very specific questions. We asked them about, let's see. Here's me looking at the slide saying, I'm very clever and I'm showing you exactly the slide that you're interested in, and I'm not. Sorry about that. So we asked them very specific questions about, as I said, agricultural land area. Is that going to increase, decrease? How much is it going to be? Is it going to increase by? If it could decrease, how much would it decrease by? What's going to happen to livestock pasture? What's going to happen to crop diversity? So we developed very specific questions for them. And in fact, in some ways, we were aided by the situation with the pandemic, in that it was a Zoom meeting and people could just come in and give their opinions. So, and of course, we're all doing more of that now anyway. So that sort of may be a kind of an upside into the future of ways of doing this, just to have very targeted conversations where you need those kind of inputs.
How did you harmonize the input? Because I think one told one number and the other one told another number, I suppose, right? How did you put it together to a consistent set of quantifications for the model?
Yeah, so we got the information together, me and my postdoc, we sat around a table, we had a bit of a go, we took it back to the group and, kind of explained that not all your views may be in here, but this is a consensus. So we went back and forth with it. And I think we were a kind of small enough group, 15 or so for each country, including us, that it was kind of possible to do that. If we'd have had, 150 or 50 even, I think that would have been a lot harder. But again, this comes down to choosing who these individuals are that you want to engage with, right? Because if these are the individuals, and it did happen in a number of occasions where, as I say, we got these sort of open doors towards some policy dialogue. If these are the people who are going to give us those open doors, then their views can count for many reasons, but not least because we're going to be listened to, and if they're the people who are already being listened to, maybe 15 is an appropriate kind of number to go for. So.
For plausible quantifications.
Well,
okay.
And we had academics on the group as well, but I mean, I take your point. You're either small and consensus is easier, and you might be wrong, or you're big and consensus is difficult. So, take that point.
Great, thanks very much, Andy. Could I invite Anna and Paula to come up to the panel, and could somebody lock the doors at the back? No, nobody's tried to escape. Fantastic. You're all so excited now, aren't you? So now we're going to seamlessly move into the final part of the session. We will truncate it a little bit, so you get a bit of a break before the plenary. But I think it's really good if we do sort of pick up on some of the issues that have been raised so far in the discussion. And I think there's lots of interesting points that have been raised. We have got a couple of pre-prepared questions, but I think to start with, I'd just like to throw things back into the floor here, because I know there were people who had their hands up earlier, wanted to ask questions and didn't have an opportunity. So let's start with some general questions. There's a hand up here. I note you here. And Matthias, I know you're here. And Abby, you're here as well. So we've got those 4 questions to kick us off.
Thanks. Michiel from Wageningen Economic Research. I guess a question to the first 2 presenters, because you both undertook a sort of participatory development process, but starting with the SSPs. So I was just wondering if there were also stakeholders who questioned the SSPs themselves, because they basically were confronted with them. And I guess if it's really participatory, they might say, well, this is nice, but actually we do not agree with them, or we want to start all over from the start. So I was wondering if this actually happened and how you dealt with it.
Right. Should I?
You please, yeah.
Okay, thanks for the question. Yes, at least, well, since we aim to introduce the SSPs at the workshop so that the stakeholders didn't really have that much previous knowledge on it, or that we didn't provide them as much previous knowledge. And there was some disagreement, if you will, maybe at the workshop for the health and social welfare sector at least. I guess at the workshop we sort of tried to, maybe with some facilitation techniques, try to sort of maybe get those participants out of that mindset in a way. Sometimes it maybe was successful, sometimes not. And then, for instance, in the analysis we are doing for the SSPs, we are trying to sort of, we're going through the comments, the material, and then try to spot out the comments that were opposing the worldviews of SSPs, for instance. So, but how that actually develops in the analysis, I'll let you know when the paper is ready.
Sorry, I can just quickly say no. Which was kind of, so for the UK situation, actually no, really surprisingly actually. They were kind of accepted. I suspect there was at least some prior knowledge of them, and also it was recognised as a big gap. So I think that because the RCPs had been, our UK climate projections had been around for a couple of years, so it was recognised in both policy and academia that this was a gap that needed to be filled. So there wasn't, we did have discussions within SSPs, obviously, of divergent viewpoints. And in previous exercises with SSPs, we have had, again, stakeholders who've really struggled to have a futures mindset, so just can't get out of present day thinking. And professional facilitation really helps at that point in time, because they can really block for progress. So yeah, not with the UK. And I think it was just the context and the fact that there was a recognised need.
Hi, I'm Kai from the University of Edinburgh. So I projected health-related adaptive capacities to heat and cold in the UK using the UK SSP products. So that's really helpful for me. And I have 2 questions, I guess, to all presenters. So the first one is, when I'm reading the narratives of the UK SSP, I feel like I'm reading a novel. And I'm just wondering, like, when you are constructing the narratives, how do you manage the balance between detail and flexibility? So the second question is also linked to what Paula just said, like some people may lack a future mindset, and when I'm saying that, oh, I'm going to project the adaptive capacities into the future, some people suggest me to, oh, you should look at this policy document and that policy document. Yeah, but that's not really the same with SSPs. They are different world trajectories. So have you encountered similar situations, and how do you manage this?
I'll have a go at the first one first, and then I'm going to skip to someone else while I work out what the second one was, because I was too busy thinking about my answer to the first one, which is my own fault. But so in our case, the kind of calibrated statement and implication statement approach that I mentioned a couple of times gave us that more atomized view. And in fact, on the website, I think that we've actually got that full list of these statements. So we have these kind of calibrated statements with an assessment of the robustness across the ensemble members and the agreement across literature. So these short IPCC type statements about the outputs from each model, and then those fed into to separate statements made by wider experts. So we can categorize those in different places under different headings, and people can go straight to the bit that they're interested in. And that in a way, that sounds great, and like it's a good answer to that question, because you don't end up with these longer narratives. In practice, I think they can still be quite hard to use, and I think there may be something in between is what we might think about for next time, because in a way, maybe they were too atomized. We then had the longer documents as well, but I think that kind of approach of breaking it down into calibrated and implication statements is a useful step in that direction, a kind of partial answer, if you like.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I can just quickly reflect on how to manage with the detail and flexibility with the narratives. Is this on? Yeah, good. So I guess the whole process of these 7 steps to heaven was aiming to sort of provide a consistent yet flexible narrative in a way, but the actual process is rather demanding. We actually used this to analyze the material and code the material. We used in vivo, this qualitative analysis tool, to make it more coherent, the material there. And also we did some consistency checks with the facilitators, note takers, also the stakeholders, so that they could validate the results. So and also we had a goal in mind, so that we didn't aim for novels per se, at least, so rather just short stories. So that was also a way to manage with this, I would say. And I'm sorry, I also have no insight for the second question.
So I would sort of say for the UK ones, I guess we were in the unique position where we had 2 sequential projects. So the narratives that came out from the first project were about 1 to 2 pages, because it's really all of the information that you can extract in a single workshop. There's only so much you can do, even with detailed note takers, recordings and things. What we were able to do in the second workshop, because the stakeholders actually used the narratives from the first workshops and then elaborated them with either comments or actually edited directly into the document. So we were able to get that. But then there was a lot of work for the project team then in just ensuring that there was consistency both across the 5 SSPs, but also that we were inclusive of the 14 driver categories that the stakeholders already identified that were really important. So was there a little bit of something on all those 14 drivers in each of the 3 time slices in all 5 SSPs? And also some of our main sectors, again, because we were trying to be quite comprehensive in sectoral coverage. And also we had the 4 nations. So actually when we started to make a multiple matrix of everything, and you even just have a little bit on each, your narratives do start to get longer and longer and longer, and you do have to be careful. But also having the second iteration helped us frame that flexibility question back to the stakeholders. And some of the things that changed, for example, in SSP1, both sets of workshops wanted there to be a move from a traditional economic system in SSP1. In the first workshop, the stakeholders very specific and said it's a non-monetary system. The second set of stakeholders said, no, that's way too specific. We just want to move to something that's more novel in terms of economics. So it became much more flexible then for other people using those scenarios to just change that context for their own specific situation. And your second question is, I think it's really difficult. I think you really just have to be blunt and sort of say these policy documents are not relevant in these future worlds. The only way we've kind of done it with current policy documents is once you've already got your scenarios and you're trying to almost look at more the SPA side, the shared policy assumptions, and about how you might move forwards. And we've almost tried to use current policy documents as stress tests. So which of these policies would stand up in this world and which would fail? And that way it soon becomes clear to a stakeholder in SSP3, if your governance is collapsing, this really top-down style of policy won't work. So you could try something like that.
Great. So I think we've got two questions from the floor, and then I think we're going to probably wrap up. I'm just going to go back to the panel and ask you to sort of summarize your thoughts about ways forward. But let's take these two questions. Abi.
Abi from Brunel University. My question is to Paula, but maybe relevant to all speakers. Can you elaborate what was the process in selecting the stakeholders, and whether you have experienced a distinct worldview from the different national participants about the whole of the UK vision, and how did you resolve that? But that applies for the other cases as well at the national level. If there are participants who came from a local scale, and was there any distinct vision about national under each scenario and national level, and how did you harmonize those? Thank you.
Yes, so we went through, I guess, what a lot of people use as a stakeholder mapping and identification process. So we agreed a set of criteria. So what were the sectors, the disciplines, the nations, other things like sort of gender and age. So we had a set of criteria. And then literally we went through all of our knowledge of stakeholders and reached out to colleagues of knowledge of stakeholders and almost came up with a very long list of about 200 stakeholders, and then tried to match criteria. So in the physical workshop, we knew we can only afford to have about 25 participants. So what's the best match that we could come to? And then you kind of need backups, because if people then say no, you need to sort of try and replace them with someone that meets as many criteria as possible. With online, it was an awful lot easier because we could have a lot more people as well. So it felt like we could be more inclusive and it was easier to meet criteria. The difficulty with the online is we did it in 8 1.5-hour sessions spread out over 4 days, because it's quite a lot of heavy iterative process that your stakeholders can't go and do their emails at the same time. They have to be fully engaged. So we kept the sessions short. But you do occasionally have stakeholders who can do 7 sessions and not 8. So we had to put in process that it was hard work on the project team, because we had to keep quite detailed notes and summarize them at the end of each session, so a stakeholder could very quickly catch up and still play an active role then in the next session. In terms of the representation and the sort of the different views the stakeholders have, I mean, I guess that's also a key role for the facilitators in just making sure everybody has a voice, and then how we handle the final input that goes into it. To be honest, I think in the UK situation, there wasn't any real tension points on certain issues, surprisingly, or certainly not. I mean, I guess the thing is, because I was in the SSP3 group helping to sort of facilitate it from a content side, and that's the one you would think there might be more tension in, because people think of that evolving in very different ways. But actually, I think people got very imaginative and actually really enjoyed the exercise. And I think they then start to spark off each other more than anything else. But I guess people have always got their own local experience that they bring to the table, which is then, of course, different. But that's good. Bringing that diversity then, I think, enrich the narratives further. Do you?
So for the selection of stakeholders, I mean, we relied heavily on FANRAPAN, who are our partners, and have key nodes in each country and the network that they have in identifying people. We really wanted people who were willing to engage, and we had a kind of relatively large task force group with terms of reference, but it quickly became aware that there were some individuals, and much more so than others, who really did want to have conversation and engage with us. And I think those key individuals proved to be very important, and as it comes back to this issue of having a pathway into the policy, really. So that's yeah. And then the national versus local question, we didn't really have that issue, but actually that is something we're going to have in the 1CG project Climber, where we are going to go across scales, at least for Kenya, and that'll be interesting to try and make sure that those voices are heard kind of up and down those scales before we have that final synthesis. So yeah, watch this space, maybe in scenarios 2026.
Is that on? Matthias Garschang, University of Munich, LMU. Thanks very much, very useful presentations. I have a question to the colleague from Finland for the excellent work and presentation, and then more of a comment. I turn it into a comment to save time. So the question is, I heard a lot of interesting stuff in your storylines, in your narratives about social cohesion and nationalism and so forth, very indigenous factors, you could say. Which role did, maybe I missed it, but which role did really larger economic outlook questions play? Inflation, all the stuff that is up in the news now, inflation and global downturn, trade downturn, and that sort of thing. Which role did that really play, particularly in SSP3 maybe? That would be interesting because we have similar processes, and that's actually a question. And that leads me to my comment. Quite interesting, I think in many of these processes we talk a lot about validity and how it comes from inviting the right stakeholders. Should we not also talk about validity and when in time do we do these stakeholder workshops? We are now engaged in a couple of processes where these things, to think about economic downturn and crises and so forth, we tend to say now, yeah, we're in a particular time, we have COVID and now the Ukrainian war, and that is non-normal. I would say it's actually non-normal to think of a stable system as we used to have it. So are these processes really valid unless you really repeat them 2 or 3 times over a time span of 2 or 3 years, and then you find a sort of a less biased, temporally biased picture? That's something we are struggling with, and your viewpoints would be quite interesting. Thanks.
Thanks so much for the question and comment. On the economic development, that did play a role in SSP, or in all of the SSPs in the narratives, yes, that's for sure. But then the economic side was really revolving around the healthcare system as a service, more or less. So in terms of or terms like inflation, etc., they didn't really occur in the narratives. I might need to check that, but at least, I don't think that was really an issue. But yeah, sure, but they did. Economic development was there, but through the sector. And then very important comment about the stakeholder engagement process and how that should be done. I think we've raised this in some of the sessions, that the stakeholder fatigue is also something that we should consider in all of this. This is very heavy work. It's also heavy work for the stakeholders. They need to sort of process a difficult framework, if you will, and also sort of be able to relate it to their own everyday work. So yeah, that's a very, very valid comment.
Anyone else?
Yeah, just really quickly on your the time component, and I completely agree, and it really played a role in our work, because our 2018 workshop was just around the time of Brexit, and then our 2020 workshop was just in the height of the pandemic. So both issues played a big role in terms of what was prominent in stakeholders' minds. And we kind of knew going into 2018 that Brexit would be a really big one. But actually, at that point in time of the workshop, we didn't know what was going to happen, whether we were going to be in or out. So we had to be really careful with the professional facilitator beforehand, saying, we don't want all of our storylines to start with, we're in or out of Brexit. That's got to be played down, and we've got to go to a bigger issue around sort of our international relationships and things like that. So we were able to sort of soften that down a bit. And then when the pandemic came up, we brought that in actually right into the first session, when we were identifying important drivers, because it was obviously right in everybody's brains. And that's why we ended up with one of our clusters, driver clusters, was response to global shocks in the end, which was pretty much all the COVID stuff coming in there. And then the polarities were whether it was basically you would carry on as normal and just resume activities as per the shock, or whether you would use it to transform your system. So it was more like, was the response, all right, that's happened, we're not going to really do anything, or are we going to recognize that means we need a more transformative, resilient system? So they did integrate that in a little bit into the narrative, but hopefully without it completely taking over. But I agree, I'm sure if we did it again in another 5 years, there'll be something else happening that would be in the minds of stakeholders.
Great, thank you very much. I think we are basically going to need to wrap up now. To give you time to get to the plenary. But before I let you slip the leash, I'm just going to return one more time to our panel members. You've got 30 seconds each. What are the critical ways forward for national scale scenario development in 30 seconds? This is your elevator pitch. Go for it. Okay. Who wants to start?
I'll say iteration is key. I know it's completely dependent on your project length, your funding, But actually, if the more you can iterate, the more consistency you're going to get, the more stakeholders you can involve, so they become more relevant and more legitimate.
It's hard to add something to that, but I completely agree. The importance of this participatory approach has been quite relevant also in our session, and also both the qualitative and quantitative methods are apparently needed here, so we should aim for those.
In our next phase of the iFeed work in climate, we're going to focus even more strongly, I think, on policy, and that there might be a sort of sweet spot in this issue of being in whether you've got comparability or whether you're doing something very specific. Maybe we can look at specific policies across different countries, and we'll retain some comparability. It will take us a bit further away from SSPs, but what we're really interested in is the kind of ultimate usefulness. So that's the kind of sweet spot that we're likely to aim for.
That's great. Thank you very much, the three of you. And that's it. Thank you, everyone, for joining this and for being so participatory yourselves in this session. There was a really interesting discussion. Thanks very much. And I'd like to ask you just to give thanks also to our speakers today. And with a brisk walk, you could be in the plenary exactly on time.